Thanks, Steve. I think I've got two jobs today. One is to make sure we don't get too much duplication, but the other one is to try and give a practical approach to the sort of vision that Michael shared and actually bring it back to what it means today from a very practical perspective. If we go back, Bud, and look at the two things that are driving the technology, from a Volvo perspective, we're starting to listen to our cities, and it's not so much about what the vehicle needs, but it's about what the population needs. So the discussions we've heard about air pollution and noise pollution are one of the key drivers. What the public want in cities and how livable our cities are is a key. And the technologies that you've heard about and the technology that we have allows us to vary our vehicle's operation. So it may be that near a hospital, near a school, near different places of residence, you want that silent operation, whereas you can operate in another mode in other parts of the city. So the way that the vehicle works in the city and how the city works becomes more and more important with zones and some of the things we've seen over the last 2 days. Talk about that. The other issue does relate to resources, but if I give a slightly different take on resources, if indeed our resources are scarce and if indeed there is a limited number of resources, then what we do with each one is vitally important. Making the choice to put diesel in a bus as opposed to make electricity from diesel, turning biogas into electricity rather than sticking it into a bus. Those choices that we actually have to make for resources are more and more important. So as we talk to government, they actually want to know that we're using it in the most efficient way. If you look at a diesel bus, if you look at gas buses, etc., the efficiency is quite questionable. Because like Michael said, until you start recapturing the loss through braking and other things, it's an inefficient use of that resource. So as we go forward and we think about what do we actually put into the bus to make it go, or whether indeed we go towards electricity as the future, how we create that electricity and what resource we use becomes really, really important. The journey we've heard about today is one we share a vision in. There will be a place for different vehicle types in cities. There will be a place for different vehicle types in different applications. But certainly this journey you've heard about today from hybrid to full electric is one we see. But from an operator perspective, or when we have the discussion, there's a couple of key considerations and really sort of a back to basics. And the guys have touched on some of them so far. But this concept of trading off the weight of the vehicle versus the range of the vehicle and the capacity of the vehicle is key. I'm sure we could all develop a bus that will run all day without charge, but we won't be able to carry passengers. On the flip side, we can develop a vehicle that has twice the capacity we have today, but you'll need to charge it every 2 or 3 kilometres. So this trade-off, as you look at the operation and how we apply the technology to different routes, becomes quite considerable. As I said before, looking at where the electricity comes from is really important. We have good examples with aquatic power, we have wind farms, etc. The types of renewable energy where the energy comes from a source that we would argue is clean from the start, and we can debate whether some of those are as clean as we think. But certainly, if we use a Victorian example, the burning of brown coal to run buses isn't probably the most environmentally friendly way to run a bus fleet in that particular city. Government policy will drive it, so what governments want and what governments think about their cities and how they want their cities to work. And we've heard a lot about the federal government's now investment or in thinking about cities and how they work, listening to the cities and how they operate. And then finally, something Michael touched on, the business model. The business model is not a traditional business model. To walk in, buy a bus, fuel it up, the business model when you start looking at these technologies changes quite a bit. And if I take an example that started in June, which we have some involvement in, it's Electricity is the project, and it's a project in Gothenburg in Sweden. And the list of stakeholders you can see on the chart there are actually the number of stakeholders involved in the project. And some of those are the electricity provider, the provider of city infrastructure, the landowners or the technology park owners where the vehicles operate, the operator, and in this case it's VAS traffic, as well as the universities that are studying and working with the other stakeholders in this project. So you can see the number of people involved. So the way that this project may work, or the way that you are charged for electricity, the way you're charged for your energy or your fuel going forward, might look distinctly different to what it is today. And what we're starting to see a trend with is that the electricity companies are taking that infrastructure investment because it's a way for them to deliver revenue. So they become a partner in the bus industry. So we start looking at energy companies, electrical companies, and providers of resources in a very different way. So it is a different business model when we start moving the direction that Michael and others have spoken about. In this particular case, it's a commercial route. There's 10 buses on the route. 3 of them are full electric, and then 7 of them are plug-in vehicles, pardon me. In this particular example, based on the need of the route and the planning, they are charged every 20 kilometres. They have a range of 20 kilometres with a charge of 6 minutes. And by making that trade-off, the buses are actually carrying equal to or slightly more than the diesel buses that were running this route 12 months ago. So as I said before, when you start looking at that trade-off of charge time, battery weight and capacity, you make decisions about will it fit with timetable, will it fit with the schedule, and how will it work. In this particular case, all the buses are geo-fenced as well. So geo-fencing means we use GPS technology to know where the bus is and decide when the engine will and won't run in silent mode. And that's on the plug-in vehicles. But the types of things this gives us the possibility to do is to really change the way that the bus interacts with the city. So in this particular example, there's a bus stop in one of the city libraries. Because when that bus comes in, as Michael said, at the low speeds, you can't hear it. So it's an example of where you could have bus stops and interchanges in shopping centres, underground, where typically pollution is a problem, in other city infrastructure where you start to have this merger between transport and the way the city's working. And it's an example of what's possible by taking the technology and then applying it in a very commercial way. So the types of things we've heard about today, it can be done, and here's a living example which is working. But the other thing I'd say that even in this space, not all buses are created equal. I mean, we can all argue that about diesel buses. But if we look at this particular region, and Michael showed the growth in Asia, but if you look already, there are more electric buses in Asia Pacific and China than there are anywhere else in the world. There is 1,000 upon 1,000 of buses running electrically today. There's complete cities in China running electrically, and they've been doing it for a period of time. But if we have a look at the assets and how they apply to the Australian market, which is what we're here to talk about, some of those buses might last for 3 years and some might get to 7, but certainly the technologies to get us out to the current life expectancy of our industry are not there, and they're not there yet, and they're coming, I think. And the same principles apply as in running a diesel bus, the things that are important about reliability and uptime. One of the key differences is training, because there's a whole competence gap here related to dealing with high voltage electrical vehicles. So the traditional mechanic, the training the emergency services, they're all things that we have to do when we start making this technology shift and using electric and high voltage electric vehicles. And whilst we can debate all day and we could have another session on should it be a parallel hybrid or a serial hybrid or all the different types of technologies, in the end it doesn't really matter, because as an operator you should be looking for the same things as you look today from a diesel bus. The efficiency, the cost of operation, the reliability. And probably a word of caution is there's a lot of hybrid vehicles we see. Just because it's a hybrid doesn't mean it's optimised. Some of the things, if you have a diesel engine with a genset on the back to run some of the electrical items on the bus, some would call that a hybrid. Technically it probably is. But in terms of being an efficient way to use energy, an efficient way to use the engine and the electric motor in tandem, it might not necessarily be the right way. And from an Australian perspective, it's still in its infancy, but there have been 3 independent studies run into hybrid vehicles. So this is diesel electric vehicles over the years. And some of them are quite old, and to be fair, we go back in this to 2012. But we see the differential coming, and in this case there's an advantage because the control vehicle has been the same in all 3 tests, and it just happens to be one of our 7-litre products. But when you make that comparison of what the saving is, the most recent one and the most recent independent study is the one that the PTA in Perth have been running, and that trial is now 18 months old, where they put a hybrid vehicle into the CAT service in the centre of the city. And you can see that the before position being a very high idle route, very low average speed, fuel consumption even in the diesel vehicle here is quite high. But then we can see the saving of fuel, purely on fuel, of around 25%. And that's through the Perth summer and the 10, 15 days over 40 degrees and trying to deal with some of the variables like Michael showed that it does have an impact, but still an outcome. And what's not so important here is the number, but it's then how do we translate into what it means financially. And as I talk here, and I have to be very clear for competitive reasons, when I talk here I'm going to talk about recommended retail pricing, just so we're clear. The commercial application of hybrids we think is closer than ever. So when I talk about the gap here, the gap in Australia is getting less and less and less and less year on year. And if we look at it 5 years ago to now, the gap is as small as it's been and it's getting smaller. And so to set this up, a couple of elements that right now the complete bus cost is 20% more than a standard diesel in our particular case. In the PTA study, which was done over a lifetime of 15 years, over that 15 years, including the vehicle price, plus the servicing, plus the repair, plus the batteries, plus the fuel over that period, the gap between diesel and hybrid today was $102,000. So it would cost $102,000 more Australian over 15 years to adopt the hybrid technology versus the diesel. And what we saw in that example is the maintenance and repair costs are quite similar. The fuel saving largely offsets the battery cost. And to paint a picture of where that break-even point is to make that gap go away, fuel would need to go to $1.80. And if we look at the price of fuel in Australia, it's one of the biggest inhibitors to hybrid technology because it's just so cheap, comparatively speaking, on a global scale. It really is. So when we look at this gap and what's happening and how could we foster the adoption, I suppose to our government friends in the room, that's not a big gap if we want to make a meaningful change from an environmental perspective, either funding that upfront capital difference or looking at over the life of the bus. It's getting closer and closer, as I said. For us, we see hybrid as the next step. It is a journey to electric like the other speakers have talked about. There's things to be done, there's technologies to be done, but certainly we see that as the next step. So from a perspective, and we heard before, this is an off-the-shelf product, it's not something out. But the two main things that will drive the adoption in Australia and the Australian industry, and being very practical, firstly it's the government support and incentives. If that incentive was there to take that gap away, then the adoption and the emission impact and the good work we could do towards the environment would be amazing. I mean, it's an exciting time, as I think Michael said. It's an exciting time when you think about the contribution we could make with a little bit of help. And then the second thing that will clearly change that gap is fuel prices. So that if we have this escalation in fuel prices or we have an issue with oil, etc., then we'll start to see that gap come down. But at least there's a quantum there and they're real figures and talking about it today. And so as I said, hybrid technology as a first step is certainly increasingly affordable, and that gap's coming down, and you can see some of the vehicles we have running. That's me for today. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions, like Steve said at the end, and then continue those discussions outside. Thanks very much.